Hello and welcome back to Beyond Boxes. This is a podcast episode, which means that you can listen wherever you listen to your podcasts or watch right here on YouTube. Today, I am so happy to be joined by the wonderful Roxy Manning. Welcome, Roxy, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Jaya. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you here. I've been a huge fan of your work, obviously in the nonviolent communication community, but also all the work you do around like racism and oppression. I really enjoyed the conversation we had about microaggressions for the Trauma Super Conference. And I think you're just wonderful. So I'm honored that you're joining me today.
Thank you. And it really does feel like the honor is mine, especially because you're doing such amazing work in the world, helping to lift up people's voices and stories so that the folks who are making a difference can really be seen and amplified.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot. So before we get started, do you want to let us know which labels, if any, you identify with?
Ooh, even that question of which ones do I identify with is a really interesting question. I can name that the ones that have been applied to me are Black, Afro-Caribbean, Trinidadian, female-bodied, parent. It's a label that I love being a mother. Hearing impaired, fat, bisexual. I actually feel vulnerable saying that one. It's so interesting to notice because I'm aware of how many people around the world are still persecuted for their sexuality. And it brings up both like some vulnerability around naming it and then going into parts of the world where I teach. Yeah, it's interesting to notice that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing all those labels with us. And thank you as well for sharing that vulnerability and noticing which ones are easier to express and which ones feel more uncomfortable. I think that is really interesting. Yeah. And do you want to share a little bit about your work and what it is you do and why it's important to you?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a psychologist. That's how I was trained. But after I got my psychology degree, I was introduced to nonviolent communication. And so what I do now is I bring nonviolent communication to organizations, people, anybody who wants to learn about it. But I'm especially interested in the intersection of how nonviolent communication can support us in especially issues around oppression. I work a lot around racial oppression, but any kind of oppression, right? And what I find is so crucial for the work that I'm doing is that it helps to create a new narrative. Recently, Sonia Renee Taylor, oh, sorry, I hate when I mispronounce someone's names, was talking about this incident that happened with Chris Rock and Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith at the Oscars. And she talked about what it would have meant if Will Smith had had different tools, right? So it's like people need to have the consciousness, and there are lots of folks out there who are doing amazing jobs of helping people have the consciousness about the work that they do, like what what does it mean to live in a more equitable way, right? But people don't actually have the tools. It's like, I know I want to be better, but I don't know how to be better. I don't know exactly what to do. I don't know how to speak when I want to address something that's coming up. And that's the work that I do, helping people like translate intention into practice.
That's fantastic. I love that description of your work. I think that's so wonderful. And I love that you also use nonviolent communication as a tool. That's also one of the tools that I use in my workshops on power, privilege, and prejudice, which is, I think we work in similar ways. So I think that's really fantastic. And so do you want to tell us a bit about your personal history, which led you to finding those tools for yourself and to then educating others and teaching those tools?
Sure. So I came to the United States from Trinidad when I was 7, and that was in some ways a really big shock that I didn't get how big a trauma it was until I had grown up. But I went from a place where I kind of fit in, it was my culture, I matched what was happening around me. And I was also seen and celebrated for the gifts that I had. And then I come to the United States, and because I'm a Black small child, I received a lot of discrimination, both within my community in Harlem, where the kinds of ways that I was showing up wasn't accepted, wasn't customary. And then also when I started going to schools where there were primarily white folks, people were always questioning my legitimacy. Like, why are you in this school for the gifted? It's like, because I took the same test that you took. But I still was always challenged and not seen for who I was. And so I grew up with this idea that in some ways, a lot of internalized oppression myself, this belief that I just wasn't good enough, that I had to do more, be better, that something about me had to prove to other people that I belonged, that I had value. And part of the way that I did that was that I always took care of other people. It's like, if I can be useful, if I could make sure that other people were doing well, if they could see me as someone who benefited them, then I would belong. And so when I finished getting my psychology degree, I'm a clinical psychologist. My advisor came to me and said, you know what? I've discovered this amazing thing. And it was nonviolent communication. And she said to me at the time, I had no idea what it meant. She said, you are so disconnected from your needs. You really need to know this stuff. And she was right. A lifetime of doing what was expected, of always doing things in some ways to buy belonging, meant that I wasn't actually tuning into what did I want? What did I value? What did I need? And about the same time that she brought this to me, I also had children. I had my first son at that time and was pregnant with my second. And I realized that I didn't want them to be me. I didn't want them to grow up not knowing who they were, what they valued, not having that internal compass for themselves and that connection to that compass. And I also didn't want them to struggle in a world that would just not see their value, that every time they showed up, they would have to always fight to be seen. And that's part of why I do this work. It's like, for future generations, if I can keep adding one more step in the consciousness, in the tools that each generation gets, then down the road, 7 generations from now, we're going to have the society that I want to see.
That's wonderful. And I really hope you're right. 7 generations doesn't seem like that big a deal in the grand scheme of things when we look.
That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah. And I love that you've shared some of your personal story. I love that you've talked about your children and how important it is for you that they don't grow up feeling that same internalized oppression and lack of value that you grew up feeling. That, and it sounds like, I think, let's talk a little bit about where those internalized messages come from and how they impact us, right? Because it's so, and how they impact all of us as well. This is something that I teach in my workshops, and I don't actually record these podcast episodes in order. So just earlier today, I recorded the last episode with my brother who interviews me, and we were talking a little bit about this, about the internalized messages we receive, and around value, and around our place in the world. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little more to that.
Sure. I mean, there's so many. You asked before, which labels do I identify with, or I prefer to say have been applied to me, right? And some of those labels also came attached with meaning, right? It wasn't just like, here's this label and it's completely value neutral. So when I think about the label fat, that's one that even today, it's still a label that's completely demeaned. And so when people look at me, very few people are looking at me and going, oh, you're fat, you're lovely, right? I see how beautiful you are. It's this message that says, I get this message from everywhere I look. If I look on television, if I look in magazines, when I read stories, I grew up in a family, we were immigrants, we were relatively poor. And I remember my dad worked night shift, like second, 3 to 11. And he would come home from work at midnight, and he had a coworker. He was a machinist. He had a coworker who would give him Harlequin romances. And I was a kid who loved to read. I would read anything he put in front of me. So I grew up devouring these romances. In these romances, the heroines were always beautiful, thin, and probably blonde, right? None of the things that, well, we're going to take away the beautiful part, but thin and blonde, they don't describe me. And so what I learned, one of those internalized messages is for me to be loved, I needed to look more like that, right? I needed to straighten my hair. I needed to like work on losing weight. I needed to do all of these things if I were to be loved. And even race, all throughout my childhood, it's one of the internalized messages about race is very complicated. So I would get a lot of celebration about the fact that I was smart, but it was always this kind of like, oh, here is this smart black kid. And part of the message there is that, and it's unusual, right? So there's something unusual about being smart if you're black, which then gives me this message that black folks aren't smart.
Yeah, you're
Or
smart for a black person. You don't just get
exactly.
rewarded for your innate like intelligence. It's smart for a
Yes.
black person. There's a but behind it. There's a charge and a ickiness to it.
Yes. And part of that ickiness means that I'm always kind of going, how do I keep you seeing me as smart, right? Because if you're going to see black folks as not smart, maybe I'm going to lose that. Maybe you're going to see me like other black folks. Just think how toxic a message that is to believe as a child, right? And how much unlearning you have to do to say, what you think about me really doesn't actually matter, right? I know I'm smart. Whatever prejudices and stereotypes you have, I don't have to buy into that. I don't have to defend against it. I can just be me. And so, yeah, that message about for a black person, everything I do, the way that I sound, oh, you sound intelligent. Does that mean that there's something about the fact that I sound white, mean that you're now associating it with intelligence? There are all of these messages that I would never be enough unless I somehow managed to fit this dominant idea of what was smart, what was intelligent, etc.
Yeah.
Even now, I'll add one more thing. Um, I do a lot of work now where I'm actually working to help people learn and understand some of these internalized messages, right? My work on microaggressions that you referenced. And I think people don't even recognize the very subtle ways that they show up. So when I'm teaching and someone is really loving what I'm doing, they'll stay, not as often, because I use this as an example now as a way of heading it off, but I'll still get the, wow, you're so articulate, you're so well spoken, right? I still get the surprise that this is what I do. Or I still get pigeonholed. I'm going to be the person who talks about race. And it's like, there's a lot of other things I can offer to you, but this is now the thing. Like you get to be smart in this area and you get to have value in this area versus do you see all of me and all of what I can bring?
Yeah, I think that's so important. Do you see all of me? And I think, that's kind of where, in some ways, the title for this podcast comes from, Beyond Boxes. It's like, I am not just this one thing. I do not get to fit in just one neat box. I am a full human being. And I think what you were talking about that, like, smart for a black person, or the, like, every time you receive a compliment, not really being sure of what the intention behind it is and what the insinuations behind it is. It's like, are you genuinely giving me a compliment, or are you saying I'm smart or articulate or beautiful for a black person or for a fat person or for a, and so that constant questioning, like you say, the impact that has on oneself, especially on children, and then we grow up with those messages and constantly trying to prove ourselves, and that fear that it's going to be taken away at any point, that fear that, like, yes, one day someone won't think you're smart because you're black, so they automatically think of you as less smart when they first meet you, and then you have to prove your smartness, and then you get complimented for your smartness within that category. Like, it's not, the lack of genuinity, is that a word, of genuineness?
I get it though.
And also that kind of, constantly questioning yourself, and the extra weight, the extra layer, the extra mental and emotional labor that requires, I think, is not talked about very often, or at least in my circles. I haven't heard people put it as eloquently. And I'm not saying you're eloquent for a black person, Roxy. I'm saying I appreciate the way you summarize that.
There's something, you just touched on something that I've been thinking a lot about, and podcasts live forever, so people might not get this reference 10 years from now. But I'm thinking a lot about what happened with, like I mentioned, the Oscar debacle. And one of the concerns that I have, this thing about being smart for a Black person, is when I think about someone like Will Smith, right? He's achieved this pinnacle of success by modern society standards. And part of it is that he's been the kind of, how do you say, he's been the acceptable Black person, right? He's our superhero. He's our nice guy. He's our vulnerable person. And so now he does something that plays into the stereotypes of Black people as dangerous. And I'm actually curious, will our world be able to say, wow, this was a man in pain who did some of the horrible things that men in pain in our society have been socialized to do? And how do we call him back in? Or are they going to say, oh, see, just like every other Black person, we get to cancel him, we get to erase him from our circles now? And I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of erasing happening. There's a lot of canceling. And I want people to learn how to do different. It's like we grew up internalizing all of these beliefs. So how do we pull people back in, call them back in to their true selves when they step out of those um, values and act in accordance to the ways that we've been socialized?
Absolutely. There's two things I think you've just said which really resonate. Number one is how people in oppressed groups, in this case, Black people, are held to totally different standards. It's like there's already these stereotypes. So it's not only do you have to it's just when you make a mistake, it represents so much more than the individual. It represents, oh, look, all black men are violent and dangerous, like we always knew all along. He was the exception, but now he's become the general rule, rather than there's a man in pain, for example. And the other thing that was really resonating, the issues around cancel culture and call out culture, and how, again, in society now, we've made so much progress as a society and people are so much more aware of issues, but it's still very much this black or white thing. It's like, if you make a mistake, we're done with you. There is no room for nuance. There is no room for humanity. And by humanity, I mean the humanness of making mistakes and learning and evolving and growing as people. And that is so important. And we there, at the moment, there is no room for that. And it's like, if only there was we could live in a more kind, gentle, compassionate way where it's not just, it's Will Smith made a mistake, let's look at the context, let's understand, rather than he's a violent, dangerous black man and we should cancel him.
Yes. And this is part of the concerns to me about, quote, call out culture, right? Because if I cancel people, then what possible motive do I have to be better, to improve? If I'm going to make a mistake and now I'm like on the outside, it's not like I'm going to buy myself back in. You're always going to be looking at me as you're that person. I can no longer trust you. So in order to help people have the motivation to want to do something different, we need to actually show them, when you make a mistake, I can still see your humanity. It doesn't mean that you get to keep doing that thing. It doesn't mean I'm okay with the fact that you do it, but I get to tell you, here's why that didn't work for me. And here's what I need to see you doing differently as a way to inspire that, rather than pushing them away and assuming that somehow they will miraculously still hold that desire to change. So the cost of call out culture is so huge.
100%. I often say, sometimes I understand something doesn't mean I accept the thing. I can understand the context where someone did something. And so I can learn to forgive, or I can learn to relate and empathize. That doesn't mean I accept the behavior. I've been, if I have a conflict with someone, and it's the same with myself as well. We need to turn that compassion towards others and towards ourselves as well, of, oh, I understand that I acted inappropriately in that moment because I was triggered, because there was something that was really upsetting, and because I'm a human and I make mistakes. But that doesn't mean that it was acceptable, and I will learn from my mistakes and I apologize and I take responsibility, and we create, if only we can create that kind of culture of responsibility and change and improvement and evolution, rather than right, wrong, good, bad, black, white, kind of linear what's the word I'm looking for? I'm sort of the very sort of divisive binary. Thank you. That was the word I was looking for. That very divisive binary categories.
I 100% agree. I when I think about my work and you asked about why my work is important, I think this is exactly it, that I'm wanting to help people realize that we absolutely need more than just a consciousness. We need the tools to keep building community. I talk a lot about beloved community as Martin Luther King Jr. framed it, right? Dr. King talked about what are we working towards? We're not working just to get laws better right now. We're working to create a community where everyone belongs, where everyone has value. And I can't do that if the only way that I know that I belong, that I have value is if I push you out, because we're just flipping who's on top. And then one day you're going to have power and it's going to flip again. And I want to stop the flipping. I want to create a world where we know how to deal with harm when it happens. We know how to call for change in a way that includes everyone and doesn't continue to exclude.
100%. That's one of the things I teach as well when I do my workshops and around inclusivity that I think gets overlooked. Like we can't, all the while that one group has power over another group, then it's not an inclusive society. And exactly as you were saying, so it's like, how can we all look at ourselves, look at the areas that we do have privilege, look at the areas that we are, possibly oppressing other groups, and how can we all create positive change? How can we all take responsibility for the society that we live in, rather than just keep pointing the finger at other people to make ourselves feel good about ourselves?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this piece. Dr. Kendi, Ibram Kendi wrote that book, a couple of books, but in his book, Anti-Racist Conversations, he was talking about upliftration, this idea that the way that for a long time, people believed that Black folks can gain equality if we did things to convince white folks if we were equal and wonderful and nice and safe, right? And that doesn't work, that we need to change the laws. We need to have some of the structural changes that are necessary. And I 100% believe this, but I believe that the structural changes, when it's just a structural change without this underlying shift in the consciousness I'm wanting of holding everyone's needs, then we are just switching who's on top, right? And so somehow we need to be able to create the structural change that makes everyone equal and then maintain it by saying, and here's how we maintain the society. Here's what we do when someone strays out of this structure that we've now created.
Wonderful, 100%. I think that's so important. And I'm just reflecting and going back a little bit to what you were saying earlier about, where we get these messages from as well. And you were talking about, media and the ideal beauty standard of like thin, white, blonde, for example. And I think we forget how pervasive these messages are in all areas. I just had a recent insight where I was watching some like trashy rom-com, and it was, the stereotypical kind of like unattractive woman, and then she has a makeover, and then the man falls in love kind of thing. And I noticed that she was white, but she had very frizzy curly hair at the beginning, and then after the makeover her hair is all like long and smooth. And I realized that growing up, one of my favorite movies was Princess Diaries with Anne Hathaway, which is basically the same story. She's all like, she has glasses, she has frizzy hair, and then she has like blow dries her hair essentially, and suddenly the beauty standard is straight. And it was amazing how I hadn't realized. I remember, growing up and always wanting straight hair. And I always thought it was very much like either a race thing or this, but like how much these messages were like subtle, but that like curly hair, which is representative of like often non-white people as well, that kind of. And so it's not just around overt race, like Black is ugly and Black is inferior and white is pretty and white is superior, but like there's all these like subtle messages. And of course the people making those movies aren't consciously being like, we're going to make the character have frizzy hair pre-makeover because that represents unattractive, because we want to be racist and we want people to think that anything that's, like representative in some ways of non-white people is unattractive. It's just, we've all embedded these messages and we're all perpetuating these messages, and we internalize them. And so we play them out in society, and everyone does it, right? Regardless of your color, your gender, your thing, unless you've done a ton of work to understand these messages and undo them, And even then, I'm sure you and I, who have done a lot of work on these things, we still catch ourselves like
Absolutely.
perpetuating things and noticing these internalized ideas. So it's like we're all impacted by it. And so, as you say, it's about, we need to create structural changes, but we need to have like this like collective consciousness change as well. And I see it starting to happen slowly. I see people more interested, you know, ever since, you know, with this pandemic, people's had lots of times to think. And with the murder of George Floyd, that really triggered something, a shift, like, and then the Me Too movement a few years ago as well. Like, these are moments that, like, you know, send ripples through the sort of collective consciousness and have an impact. But like, there's people that are doing this work all the time. There's people that are fighting for these rights. There are people that are aware, and then suddenly everyone will start listening for a bit until they move on to the next topic. But it does have an impact, and this work is so important. And so I think I just wanted to bring in that piece of how subtle it is, and how, and to reinforce what you were saying around the need for both systemic change and a shift in the sort of global collective consciousness.
Yes, this piece about the subtlety of all of these different oppressions, right? It's so scary. Sometimes people say to me, like, well, aren't we just being politically correct? If I, for instance, you know, if I try to say things like, instead of saying you guys, I'll say folks, right? Or instead of saying let's all stand up for this, I'll say let's all show up, right? You know, people are like, well, aren't you just being super politically correct? And it's like, no, you know, part of the reason I want to pay attention to language, why this matters, is so that I can start to address that subtle, pervasive ways that we're elevating some groups over others, right? And doing it in ways that we're not even, it's so much a part of our culture that we're not even aware of it. And just like that little girl that you were, didn't really get, like, oh, the reason I want to straighten my hair possibly is in way because that's the definition of beautiful. It's like, why isn't my curly hair beautiful, right? It's like we just start to see it and what's the word, integrate it in ways that we don't even recognize, and then we start showing it up. So some of the hardest feedback I've gotten about my appearance are from other Black women, right? Who are like, well, why aren't you straightening your hair? Why aren't you doing this? Like, because I like my locks. I don't want to straighten my hair. And I also don't know that I need to do that to represent beauty. But it's hard to get folks to recognize all of the ways that language, what we do, how we move through the world impacts these messages or furthers those messages.
100%, absolutely. And yeah, there's so much in what you've said just then. And like, again, like, I know what you mean about sometimes the messages we receive aren't even from the people in the dominant group, but other people in the same sort of group as us. And then that can be even more painful. But like we've talked about, like, we're all internalizing the same messages. So of course it comes out, and we project that on the people around us, on the people we see. And yeah, and there's what you were saying about political correctness. It's so interesting. I just had a conversation about this a few days ago with someone, and I was saying, it's not about being politically correct. It's about respect. It's simply what people refer, the term political correctness has been used, like the term snowflake or something, you know, often by people who are being like, why are you being so sensitive? Oh, political correctness. But it all just boils down to respect. It boils down to, like, language has power. Language is important. This is why I ask people about which labels, if any, they identify with. I ask about not to put people in boxes, but because, yeah, language is important. The language we use to describe ourselves, the language other people uses to describe us, the inclusivity or lack thereof of language has a huge impact on us. And that certain shifts in language can make a huge difference. And even if we don't know always the evolution of language, like, sometimes it's good to question, where did that language come from? And when we look back at it, often the answers are horrific, and people are like, yeah, but that's no longer what I mean. And it's like, but that's still where that originated from. And so again, like you're saying, it's, you know, I know that I still struggle at not saying guys anymore. It's still so part of my vocabulary, and I catch myself saying it. and I sometimes like shrug it off and things like that. But and so again, when it's not about punishing people for using the wrong language.
Right.
It's not about, like we were talking about, call out culture or cancel culture. It's not about canceling everyone who still says, hey guys, you know, it's about understanding that by saying guys is not very inclusive of everyone, and the importance of inclusivity, like we've spoken about. It's because unless everyone is included, then we will continue having the power dynamics where certain groups have power over others, and we will continue perpetuating these like rigid and painful systems where certain people are treated as subhuman. And, you know, I've recorded an episode for this podcast with someone who is a former sex worker. And that's another group of people that are treated literally as subhuman. I was having a conversation yesterday with my friend about a homeless man. She had some thoughts around like, you know, trying to control whether she should give him money or not, or trying to purchase something for him and all of that, which is like slightly belittling and dehumanizing, whereas it's a grown up, he can decide what to do with that money, for example. But then he like followed her in the street and was very kind of like harassing her and things like that. You know, we sometimes use language where we belittle groups of people, but we also infantilize them, or and so either by like controlling how they can spend their money, but also in like thinking, oh well, then he can't do it, poor him, he's homeless, he can't do anything wrong. And it's like, whether he's homeless or not, as a man, the way he treated a woman and followed her down the street and was like harassing her and not taking no for an answer, for example, that's also inappropriate, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It's what you said earlier about bringing back nuance, right? That recognizing that nobody, the minute I put someone in a box for any reason, I miss all of these other opportunities to engage with them about the things that matter. So if I put, like you described, if I put this person who's unhoused in this box and say, oh, well, I need to both empower him, because in some ways, even this idea, like this question about the money is a really interesting one, right? Because I want people to decide and have agency of what to do with their money. And I also want people to have agency to decide, where do I want my resources to go? So it's almost like, how do I support a discussion between these folks, rather than, like, I would love to see an authentic discussion that says, I'd love to give you money. I'm concerned that you might use it for drugs. And I'd actually love you to tell me what you'd like the money for. And if what you want to use the money for matches what I want to give money to, go for it. And if you say, yeah, I'm going to use it for drugs because someone else gave me food later, I get to decide, is that where I want my money to go? Right? And so how do you actually have a conversation where it's about really hearing and listening to each person and interacting with them in ways that honor each person's choices, and it isn't really demonizing? Because if someone says to me, I want to buy drugs, I'm like, okay, you actually get to do that. That's not, I don't have a say either way. I still always want to know, what do I want my money to support, right? And so it's a really interesting struggle around how to really engage with people in ways that honor each person's agency and each person's fullness of who they are and what they're bringing into the world. And in ways that don't excuse certain behaviors, because I think that this person's been oppressed, this person's been X, Y, or Z, that really holds everyone to a standard of their full humanity and full accountability to each other.
Absolutely. And again, you know, we were talking earlier about sort of nuance, and there's a couple of things that stand out. One is that if we really see the person opposite us as a human, then we can easily engage in conversation. And, you know, so what I'm curious suddenly, like, because I know for myself that often I don't, like, if someone asks me for money, it's never occurred to me to just be like, oh, you know, what is this money for, or whatever it is. Maybe that, I don't know if that's the only example, but it's like, oh yeah, like, whereas if one of my friends would ask me for money, you know, or someone I knew, I would never for a second hesitate to ask them, sure, but like, why, or how can I support you, or is there, or like if they were asking me for something and it didn't feel quite right and I felt like maybe it wouldn't be supportive to them, to say something like, is there another way I can support you, or whatever it is, but to engage in conversation, to understand, to connect. And it's true, when we don't humanize people, then we don't do that. We make assumptions, we make projections, we think we know better than them. And
Yes.
part of that is just also how well you know someone. Of course, it's easier with a friend or a family member than a stranger. But I think part of it is also the bias we have and the prejudices we have and project onto certain groups of people.
Yes. And as you were speaking, I also realized the third part of it is the way that we're living in society today, that even to have that conversation, I'll make time for that conversation with my friend, right? Wow, you're needing money? Wow, let's sit down and let me hear what's going on for you. But if it's someone on the street who's asking me as I'm rushing to work or rushing to do X, Y, or Z, the decision to make the time, not just to recognize somebody's humanity, but to engage with it, is one that we often don't build into our lives. What would it mean to sit down? I work with folks who are unhoused in my job as a psychologist. And one of the things that I find powerful for them is that for many people, I'm the first person who's actually just sat in front of them however they show up and just said, tell me your story, right? Tell me what's going on. Tell me what you're needing right now, and just listened. And most people make assumptions and walk by or don't even engage at all. So there's something about seeing each person's humanity, seeing them as somebody who's worthy of engagement, dialogue, connection. Oh, it would be such a world if we could do this.
100%. And the second piece that you were talking about as well, about like accountability, and which also comes in with nuance, you know, and like not excusing behaviors. And we talked about this a bit earlier, but I know, for example, a big one for that for me in relationships I've had is around mental health, for example. Sometimes people using mental health as an excuse for certain behavior.
Yeah.
And again, it's like, I understand that it impacts your behavior. I understand I'm someone who's neurodivergent and has a ton of mental health stuff. And, you know, so of course, it's really helpful to explain and to create that connection for people to understand, oh, okay, your brain might work differently to mine. So when you have certain behaviors you might have might not like be, you know, might come across differently or might be for different reasons. But ultimately, if you're doing something that's hurtful or that's harmful, then whether you are unhoused or have mental health issues or are, you know, whatever the excuse, there is no, whatever the group, it's not an excuse. It can explain, like, of course, someone who's unhoused is going to need to ask for money, and, you know, and that might be off-putting for someone else. But yeah, where am I going with this? I think it's just, again, around that nuance and the, like, the fact that we're all human and we all have, yeah, we all have areas we need to work on, and we all have
Yeah.
areas that it would be nice if other people could work on in the way they engage with us. And
Yeah. There's something as I've been listening to you, it's sparking this thought about what would it mean for me to show up with all of the challenges that I'm holding because I've occupied this body and what it means in this world, and to know that some of the ways that I show up are a natural, understandable reaction to this, right? And that it's going to impact the people that I interact with. So the fact that, for instance, I can be super reserved and super shy, and it never occurred to me that people kept saying, oh, I think you don't like me, you know, and that's why I didn't talk to you. But once people started to actually be able to say, hey, you know, I understand why you're not taking the risk of going out and talking to people, but it's actually impacting my sense of confidence in approaching you. Now we have a conversation. Like there's something about being able to name impact, not in a way that's blaming, but taking responsibility for this is what I was looking for in this moment. And when you showed up in this way, this is what got stimulated for me, so that you have that feedback. You understand, here's the impact of what you're doing. Is that something you want to work on? Great. If so, maybe we can work on it together. And if not, I get to decide for myself, am I up for that? Am I up for that continued impact? And if not, I might say I'm disengaging, not because you're bad, but because I need to take care of myself, right? So this accountability piece around being able to both understand and acknowledge why people are showing up in the way that they are, but still speak to the impact that that might be having and how to work on it together is really important.
100%. And one of the things that comes to mind as I hear you speak is, for example, I'm in a newish, well, I'm in a new relationship. I've met
Ooh.
someone, and yeah, and it's nice. And I noticed how there were a bunch of things at the beginning that I thought were red flags with their behavior because of my own history and trauma. And that, but because I done work for myself, or because things, rather than just being like, oh my God, red flag, I'm running away, I spoke to the person. I was like, hey, this thing you said or did makes me feel uncomfortable. This is why. And instead of being like, what, you're being stupid or whatever, and actually showing that it was a red flag, they were like, oh, okay, thank you for sharing that with me. I only was saying this because I was teasing you. Like, I didn't mean it, and I really understand why it's upsetting for you. I will stop this behavior. And so, you know, that kind of direct communication, that kind of enabling conversation, enabling communication, and really understanding and connecting with someone, even if you don't have the same experiences as them, is like so incredible. And one of my previous partners I was with, I remember very early on, we had a conversation and they said something that made me feel really uncomfortable. And same thing, I said, hey, and it was actually a racial thing, and they're white as well. So there's also the extra dynamics of, it's not just personal history, but it's, you know, systemic as well. And I was like, hey, that makes me uncomfortable. Here's why. And instead their response was, oh, I was just making a joke. Don't make such a big deal out of it. Like, you know, and became very dismissive and defensive. And so noticing like those two different reactions in two people where it was very similar situations. It's, I'm getting to know someone, we don't know each other very well. There's like the extra layer of like having a romantic and sexual relationship with the person. I say which, you know, creates vulnerability, so makes me more sensitive. And when I came to the person with, this makes me uncomfortable, here's why, the reaction from the other person is like, tells me a lot in terms of whether I can trust them and how we're going to meet. And so there's a couple of reasons I mentioned this. Number one is just that if we're open to listening and connecting with someone, we don't need to have the same shared experiences as them to be able to create a link, to see their humanity, to have yours seen, to be able to share something. Of course, having shared experiences helps with that. But if you're really open-minded and willing to listen and acknowledge that you might not be able to fully relate, but you can empathize with it, you can hear them, you can accept as well, like really accepting this person is sharing their experiences. It's not for me to judge that experience, to judge their reaction, but to respond to what they're requesting. And the second reason I'm sharing this is because I think it shows how, you know, we need to do the work sort of on a, like, I was able to have that conversation because I've done a huge amount of work on myself, that I'm self-aware enough that I notice, rather than just becoming reactive and like either running away from the person or like starting a fight with the person because I was upset by what they said, I was able to reflect. And so again, people sometimes talk about like personal development as separate from like social justice work, for example. And it's not, because we need to have that awareness to engage in these conversations. We need to understand and know and love ourselves and work on all our internalized messages towards ourselves, as well as our internalized messages towards other people.
Yes. There's something in what you're saying about how important the personal is on so many levels, both as someone from a group that's historically marginalized and from someone from a group that's not, yeah? And so a lot of times people are talking about, what can I do to be an ally? And I think it's exactly this piece that you named. Be curious, be super curious. When someone comes to you and says, hey, that's not working, or you see something going down and you don't understand why the folks from the different historically marginalized groups are upset, don't be like, oh, I know the answer, or I have the right way to think about this. Just say, what don't I know here? Tell me more about how this is impacting you. Tell me more about what's happening, how this connects to the different experiences that your group has experienced. And so this piece around, I don't always have to, you mentioned you had done the work, but sometimes I might not have done the work, right? Sometimes it's an issue that's coming up in an area that I don't have knowledge about. And if I just apply that principle, whatever it is, just shut up and be curious, right? will make such a huge difference in letting the person know that your concerns matter, they deserve to be aired, and that we can hold this together. So for me, that's the very first step of being an ally. Be curious.
I love that. I think it's so important. I totally agree. It's something I talk a lot about as well. Like, be curious, be open-minded, be receptive. And it's okay to not have all the answers. It's
Yes,
okay to not know. And it's okay to feel uncomfortable. Discomfort is a great thing. If you're uncomfortable, it means there is that something wants to be looked at, and there is the opportunity to grow from that, to evolve from that. And I think that's really, really important.
absolutely. And then this other piece that you named about the work that we need to do ourselves, for me, it ties back to what you had also named about the kind of almost infantilization. Like when my kids are 2 or 3, I'm like, okay, they don't know better, right? So if they're hitting me, I can like, kind of say ouch and let them have a sense that that hurts. But I'm not expecting that they're going to already know how to regulate their emotions and how to respond with any sort of upset. And we kind of give the same excuse. And I'm like, no, if someone says, and kind of going back, I'm not sure why the whole Oscar thing is on my mind, but that's exactly it with Will Smith, right? It's like, I expect him to do enough work that when something happens, I want him to be able to say, that was not okay. And I'm going to show up and I'm going to tell you that it's not okay. And I'm not going to just excuse it and say, well, this was just a manifestation of years of white supremacy. It's like, absolutely, that's true. And I still want to invite him into doing something different. And just like with my kids, if they didn't know how to do it differently, I'm going to tell them, hey, here's how you can show them better. You know, here's what you do next time. Not canceling, but making sure that we educate. So there's always this ongoing lifelong education for ourselves in understanding what our triggers are, how we might respond to it, and there's also the work that we need to do on as the allies. What do we understand about and what are we open to getting that feedback and responding in a different way?
I love that. I think that's so important. And it ties in a lot of the conversations and threads we've been having around, like not excusing behavior, but being accountable and understanding. And, it's like treating others as like responsible adults, but also remember treating ourselves as responsible adults and not, feeding the child too much at times. Do you have anything else? You've been talking about allyship. Do you have anything else that you'd like to share on how people can be allies and supportive to communities that are marginalized?
Yeah. So one really big thing is something around paying attention to who are you being an ally for, right? And so some people label it like being performative or all of these kinds of things. I'm actually thinking that whenever I take a motion, whenever I take an action as an ally, I want to be really honest with myself. Am I doing this because it's actually supporting a request that I'm getting from that group? Or am I doing it because it's helping me feel better about myself, right? I'm going to be the good person. I'm showing up and doing the right thing without a sense of checking in. Like, is this what you actually want in this moment? So one of the another really big things is to ask. Don't assume that I'm woke, I've got the answer, I'm going to step in right away without knowing, like, is this actually wanted in this moment? So this piece around asking, checking in, really huge. And then related to that is whose voices am I centering? So it's been shocking. Like whenever anything happens, like if you start to look at the discourse, oh, it's been so funny. There's been, oh, what is her name? Ijeoma Oluo had written this post saying, hey, I'd love white folks not to comment on this issue. Let Black folks talk about this. And a lot of white folks commented and said, hey, I'm going to be good and not comment. And I'm like, you're commenting, you know? So it's even like questioning myself. Why would I feel the need to say that? And I always bring it back in some ways to nonviolent communication, right? This is one of those times when being self reflective and really asking myself, why am I choosing to speak in this moment? When I speak, whose voice is now the one that's being attended to, being supported, being lifted up? And if my being silent is uncomfortable, I can quietly ask that person, would my voice be helpful here rather than just bringing my voice in, right? Don't just jump to the assumption that this is what this person is waiting for. My voice will somehow legitimize the conversation, but really check in and ask and create space for people to in some ways, even figuring it out themselves. Let them hash it out, and you're there as a resource that folks know they can call on without you having to show that I'm right there, ready to be used. It's a really subtle piece, but it's something that's been really challenging for me in a lot of the circles that I work in, that folks are always ready to jump in, bring their voice into a situation rather than say, let me step back, let me wait, let me see what's actually needed and requested of me, and then act.
I think that's such an important distinction, and I'm so glad you brought in that piece. And yeah, so thank you. I'm also curious if there are ways that you feel that you're an ally to people with either different intersections of oppression than you, or with more intersections of oppression than you, or yeah, how do you feel like you show up as an ally in your life?
Yeah, well, first I gotta be real. Like, I am so aware that there are times when I have not been a great ally, right? And that's like acknowledging that is part of, in my mind, being an ally. Part of saying, like, I don't have it all together. I make mistakes. I'm human just like everyone else. And so part of my being an ally is being able to recognize that. So that when someone tells me, hey, this thing you're doing isn't working, I can listen and take that in. And we've talked a bit about that, so I'm not going to go much more into it. But the other way is kind of really, how do you say, operationalizing what I was just talking about. So it's kind of looking on, who am I following on Instagram, right? Who am I actually paying attention to? Who am I taking moments to support, lift up their voice, repost, do things to make sure that their voices get heard? um, and without necessarily having to bring my voice into it. So that's one piece. Another piece is I do a lot of teaching just like you. And so there's so many things I don't know. I remember for one of my classes, for instance, there was someone who was vision impaired. And I tended to like do a lot of handouts with lots of small print to try to get everything to fit on the fewest number of pages. And this person was like, that's hard for me to read. And so it's helpful if everything is 12-point font or bigger. And ever since I got that, it's like really internalizing that and saying, anything I print will need to be that big font. And taking the extra step, even if it's more work, I need to get materials to people ahead of time so that they can run it through screen readers and things like that that help make it easier for them to have access. So it's really noticing that I'm not going to know how to be an ally, but whenever someone tells me, shares information with me, I take that not just as, oh, I can meet this specific request, but I can use it as, oh, and here's a line of research I can take for myself to find out what else did I not know about this, so I can incorporate that into how I show up in the work that I do.
Fantastic. I think I love that you admit, and I'm definitely the same, that it's not always easy to be an ally, but that the most important thing is that when you do get, called out, called in, or when people say, hey, this doesn't work for me and this would be supportive for me to feel included, to be like, oh, okay, and to learn from that, because we are all
Yeah.
human, as we've been talking about, and we're not all perfect and we don't know everything. And so to be open to continuously being educated and learning, and that we'll never have all the answers, but we can spend our lives learning as much as we can from each other.
Yes. There's something that comes up for me as I hear this piece around how we show up. Oh, I don't know if you've had this experience where one of the challenges I can often face, especially in the identities that I occupy, are people who are like, but you're this, therefore you should, right? It's like, because I occupy this identity, I should be completely willing to do whatever it takes for someone else in another identity. And for me, another part of, I don't know if I would call it being an ally, but being a responsible, responsive human in the world is being aware of my limitations and being willing to convey that. So if someone came to me with a request around allyship that I couldn't meet, it's part of my being an ally is saying, acknowledging that I understand the request and that I'm fully able to reflect back the needs so that they have a sense that it was heard and valued, and being really clear about what my limitations are, because that's part of what makes it sustainable for me to continue to do the work that I do, to be able to say, I'd love to meet this, and here's why I can't. Could we brainstorm together other ways that this might work for you, or other ways that we could make this experience work for you? And there's something about bringing myself into the equation in these conversations that is also part of being an ally, because it's part of building that world that's truly working for everyone, not one person above the other.
I love that. I love, love, love that. Thank you so much,
Mm.
Roxy. Roxy, how do you go beyond boxes, would you say?
I am always, always, always questioning myself. Always, always. So the biggest learning for me, and it's been huge and it's ongoing, is recognizing how much I put myself in boxes, right? So the world has put me in boxes. And in some ways, I've been the person kind of plastering those walls and making them stronger. And so part of my going beyond boxes is to reflect a lot on myself. Who am I? What am I choosing? Why am I choosing this? What are the places, like asking for feedback from my community? What am I not seeing about myself? What am I assuming is real, is the way the world is, and just acting in that place and taking steps to be vulnerable and to show my journey, so that both my journey as I come out of boxes and my journey about how hard it is to maintain living in a world beyond boxes, right? The more that I can make that transparent, what it's like to try to do this, the more I invite other people to be like, oh, okay, I get to say that I'm working on this even if I'm not perfect. I get that it's a journey. And so for me, that's one of the ways to always question myself and to assume that there are boxes that are invisible that I have not yet engaged with, and that I can continue to work on dismantling them.
Thank you. That was a fantastic answer and very inspiring. I love it. Roxy, I've loved today's conversation. It's felt very organic, and I feel like I've learned a lot. I'm sure our listeners have as well. I love the way we bounced off of each other. How can people find out more about you and your work?
Well, absolutely. They can go to my website, roxannemanning.com, or they can find me on Instagram, Roxy Manning PhD, at Roxy Manning PhD.
Amazing. Thank you so, so, so much for your time today. It's been really, really wonderful.
You're welcome. I actually want to add another plug because this is new for me and I keep forgetting about another way folks can find my work. Starting in August 2023, you can look for my book. I'll have 2 books out on anti-racist conversations. I have a publisher, and that's our tentative publication date. So start searching your book stores August 2023.
Fantastic. Well, I, for one, can't wait to purchase your book once it comes out. And I'm so excited for all our listeners to check that out as well. Thanks again, Roxy.
Thank you, Jaya. It was a pleasure.